All right.
You guys bundled up down there?
Actually, it's very nice today. It's like super nice. I was walking outside, walking my grandson with my bare feet. So we're all good. I know.
Just pour that salt in that open wound. Just
Yeah.
go ahead and pour it in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's beautiful today. Absolutely beautiful. But it's going to be cold again. We'll survive though. They're already asking. My daughter just left, and somebody was asking the Polk County School Board. They have like a forum that she checks for notices, and some parent was asking if they were going to have a cold weather day on Monday.
That's funny.
Yeah.
I don't imagine they build in any snow days into their.
No, we build in hurricane days.
Touche, yes.
Yeah, we have hurricane days, not snow days. And that's what the school board responded. Unless it's a hurricane blizzard, we're open. So
that's funny.
Yeah.
But I'm glad they prioritize education.
Yeah. Okay. We've had some tropical storm days as far as school being out, but they're rare. All right, we're going to go on with our chapter, Rome on the Potomac. After Dulles was ousted by JFK in late 1961, the old man's crowd had quickly closed ranks around him. The Luces immediately offered Dulles solace, inviting Clover and him to spend the New Year's holiday at their winter home in Phoenix. Claire Booth Luce often used the Arizona estate to recover from her own bouts of melancholy, dropping LSD with eccentric friends like Gerald Hurd, a gay Anglo-Irish writer, devotee of Eastern mysticism, and psychedelic pioneer. Clover found that Luce's desert refuge a soothing respite from the Washington vortex. Now, remember, their daughter eventually goes to New Mexico with the son that's injured and lives out the rest of her life there. Excuse me. Dulles' growing sense of resentment. Goodness. Hold on a second.
Bless you.
Okay. Dulles' growing sense of resentment towards Kennedy was shared by the Luces, who had known JFK since he was a young Navy ensign. Joe Kennedy had courted Henry Luce's support for his son during the 1960 presidential race. Dropping by the magazine mogul's Fifth Avenue apartment for lobster dinner on the final night of the Democrat convention, and afterwards watching TV together as JFK accepted his party's nomination. It was a memorable moment in my life, Luce recalled. It's quite a thing to sit with an old friend and watch his son accept the nomination as President of the United States. Luce was not the type to let sentiments cloud his political judgment, however. He remained loyal to the Republican ticket. But Life magazine, his influential flagship publication, gave Nixon a tepid endorsement, leaving the door open for Kennedy. Luce admired JFK's intellect and cultural sophistication. He did question whether he was aggressive enough on communism. After finishing their lobster dinner, in fact, Luce had warned Joe Kennedy that he would not stand it if JFK proved too much of a compromiser in the White House. If he showed any signs of weakness in general towards the anti-communist cause, or, to put it more positively, any weakness in defending and advancing the cause of the free world, which was not their cause, why then he'll certainly be against him. So you're not allowed to actually strive for world peace in any shape or fashion. You have to be a hawk or they're going to come after you. The loose honeymoon with Kennedy administration was short-lived. After the Bay of Pigs, Luce's coverage of the presidency turned increasingly negative. And by coverage, we mean propaganda. By the spring of 1963, JFK was so exasperated with the relentless drumbeat of criticism from Time Life headquarters in New York that he invited the Luces to lunch at the White House to see if there was somehow the ability to sweeten the power couple's disposition. When the press lord launched into a lengthy diatribe on Cuba, demanding that Kennedy invade the island, this is a media propagandist demanding the president take military action against Cuba. The president suggested that Luce was a warmonger, and the afternoon came to an unpleasant conclusion with the Luces marching out of the White House before dessert was even served. Luce convened a remarkable war council of his top editors at Time Life, where he declared that if the Kennedy administration was not bold enough to overthrow Castro, his corporation would take on the task itself. Luce and his wife were already funding raids on Cuba with the quiet support of the CIA. Now Luce would escalate his crusade against the Castro regime in direct defiance of Kennedy. So if you guys had any doubt of me talking about the international syndicate and them not working for the country, this removes all doubt. Like Time Life building in Manhattan, Dulles' brick house on Q Street was a boiling center of anti-Kennedy opposition. The actively, quote unquote, retired spy master maintained a busy appointment calendar, meeting not only with retired CIA old buddies like Frank Wisner and Charles Cabell, but with a steady stream of top-rank active duty agency officials like Angleton, Helms, Cord Meyer, and Desmond Fitzgerald. More surprisingly, Dulles also conferred with mid-level officials and operational officers like Howard Hunt, James Hunt, a key deputy of Angleton and no relation to Howard, and Tom Karasaman, Helms' right-hand man. McCone, too, routinely checked in with his predecessor, dining with him and sending him notes. Though Howard Hunt did not occupy the same social strata as Dulles, the two men were bonded in bitterness. They felt they had been made scapegoats for Kennedy's failure of nerve at the Bay of Pigs. He had no failure of nerves. He told them he was not going to use the military. The retired spy master sent Hunt his photograph, and Hunt gave him a copy of his Angry Cuba memoirs. Quote, "I wrote this book as an antidote to the despondency that seized me in the wake of the Cuba project," Hunt explained in the letter, "and I hope it may give you some diversion now." Serving Dulles, Hunt wrote in an early letter, was an honor that he would always cherish. Fearing that his role in the Bay of Pigs fiasco would stall his CIA career under Kennedy, Hunt sought Dulles' help in starting a new career in private security, because of course he did. It occurs to me that one of your many business contacts might have use for me abroad, particularly if something of my background were known, Hunt wrote to Dulles. Dulles told Helms, "I have always thought well of Hunt and that he was disposed to help him," agreed to get together with Hunt in September. Afterwards, Hunt decided to stay in the CIA while moonlighting as a ghostwriter for Dulles. Hunt was a prolific author and had been churning out spy novels under various pseudonyms since World War II. Dulles, who produced 4 books in retirement, including his war memoir an intelligence handbook, and 2 volumes of espionage adventures. Also worked on his literary projects with a young former CIA employee by the name of Howard Roman, whose wife Jane was employed in Angleton's deeply submerged counterintelligence unit. The CIA continued to provide a variety of services, large and small, for the former director, in addition to supplying him with ghostwriters and research material. Chef Edwards, the agency's internal security chief, even stepped in to help Dulles renew his DC driver's license in 1963 so that he could keep cruising the streets of Washington and amassing wealth and luxuries had never been important to Dulles, but he did expect to be served and pampered in his retirement. Dulles also stayed in touch with his extensive network of friends and supporters in the U.S. military, who continued to invite him to speak at defense seminars and play golf on military bases. He lunched with his fellow Bay of Pigs casualty, Arleigh Burke, at the Metropolitan Club. After Kennedy forced him out of the Navy, Burke quickly found another perch in Washington's far-flung national security complex, becoming the chairman of the newly created Center for Strategic Studies at Georgetown University. Of course, he helped co-found it with David Abshire. It was a platform he used to publicly air his grievances against the Kennedy administration. In other words, it was just another CIA mouthpiece. Burke made dark allegations about the White House's dictatorial tendencies. Again, sounds so familiar. Charging that his Georgetown offices were the target of suspicious 1963 break-in. Rising Republican politicians also sought out the retired spy chief, including young Illinois Congressman Donald Rumsfeld, who decades later would achieve notoriety for his national security reign. Rumsfeld arranged for Dulles to speak about the CIA in Cuba at the 88th Congressional Club in March of '63. Cuba remained the source of great friction within the Kennedy government. In October of 1962, these tensions came close to exploding during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when virtually the entire national security circle around the president urged him to take aggressive action that would trigger a nuclear war. JFK's lonely stand, which was supported only by his brother and McNamara within his inner circle, was a virtuoso act of leadership. As the world held its breath, the president painstakingly worked out a face-saving deal with Khrushchev that convinced the Soviet premier to withdraw the nuclear missiles from the island. It's almost hard to believe it wasn't a setup. Kennedy achieved the compromise by agreeing to remove the U.S. missiles from Turkey. This is a crazy story, which the Soviet Union found equally menacing. In fact, the president had been trying to get the obsolete Juniper missiles demobilized for over a year before this even happened. But he had been stymied by the State Department foot dragging. Just one more example of the intransigent and insubordination of his administration. JFK was furious when he learned that his original order to remove the Juniper rockets from Turkey had been ignored. Again, this sounds so familiar. The president believed he was president and that his wishes, having been made very clear, that they would be followed and the missiles removed, Bobby Kennedy later wrote. The president believed he was president. It was a striking turn of a phrase, one that captured JFK's uncertain grasp on power. The searing experience of teetering on the nuclear edge had an effect of creating a survivor's bond between Kennedy and Khrushchev. JFK came to respect the Soviet leader's earthly wisdom and surprising eloquence on behalf of peace. Quote, at the climax of the events around Cuba, there began to be a smell of burning in the air, Khrushchev wrote. He denounced the militarist who had sought a nuclear confrontation. Kennedy read aloud part of the speech to Schlesinger, adding, Khrushchev certainly has some good writers. The feeling of respect was mutual. The Soviet leader later said he came to greatly admire JFK during the missile crisis. He didn't let himself become frightened, nor was he reckless, Khrushchev wrote. He showed real wisdom and statesmanship when he turned his back on the right wing forces in the United States who were trying to goad him into military action. Kennedy's sincerity in his quest for peace continued to impress Khrushchev the following June when the U.S. leader gave an electrifying speech at American University in which he soundly rejected the assumptions of the Cold War. The address, which would go down in history as the peace speech, carried echoes of Khrushchev's own heartfelt pleas to Kennedy at the height of the Cuban crisis. When he had told JFK that the Russian people were neither barbarians nor lunatics, and they loved life as much as American people. At American University, Kennedy invoked the same sentiments in the poetic cadence of his speechwriter Sorensen. Quote, we all inhabit a small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal, unquote. JFK reinforced his path-breaking speech by dispatching Averell Harriman to Moscow the following month to hammer out a limited nuclear test ban treaty with Khrushchev, the first diplomatic breakthrough in the struggle to control the weapons race, which the hawks in America did not want controlled. They wanted people living in fear. When the triumphant Harriman returned home, his Georgetown neighbors poured into the streets outside of his brick townhouse to celebrate his achievement. One woman carrying her baby told the diplomat, I brought him because what you did in Moscow will make it possible for him to look ahead to a full and happy life. The crusty old millionaire was touched by the neighborhood welcome. Harriman told Schlesinger that by picking him for the mission instead of one of the Cold War envoys, Kennedy had persuaded Khrushchev that we really wanted an agreement and were not merely going through motions. Khrushchev had a fondness for Harriman. He called him my friend, the imperialist. JFK once confided in a friend, Bill Walton, quote, I am almost a peace at any price president, which you know they absolutely hated. It was a reference to the insult from Barry Goldwater positioning himself for the 1964 presidential race. He had begun flinging at political opponents he deemed insufficiently hawkish. By 1963, the military and espionage officials in Kennedy's government were all too aware of their commander-in-chief dedication to peace, a growing commitment to detente with the communist world that, in the minds of the National Security High Command, demonstrated JFK as naive and weak. The leadership ranks in the Pentagon and the CIA were convinced that the Cuban Missile Crisis had been the ideal opportunity for Kennedy to finally knock out the Castro regime by launching a full-scale military invasion again. The peaceful resolution of the crisis left Kennedy's warriors in a very ugly mood. Daniel Ellsberg, who later became famous for leaking the Pentagon Papers, observed the seething fury among uniformed officers when he was serving as a young defense analyst. Quote, there were virtually a coup atmosphere in the Pentagon circles. Not that I had the fear there was about to be a coup. I just thought it was a mood of hatred and rage. The atmosphere was poisonous. The anti-Kennedy feelings were particularly virulent in the Air Force, which of course was commanded by General Curtis LeMay, the guy who wanted to nuke everything. He had made his savage mark on history with the firebombing of Tokyo during World War II. The president and the general regarded each other with barely concealed disgust. 25 years after JFK's death, LeMay and his top Air Force generals were still talking about Kennedy when they sat down to be interviewed for an official Air Force oral history project. LeMay was quoted as saying, "The Kennedy administration thought that being as strong as we were was provocative to the Russians and likely would start a war. We in the Air Force, and I personally, believe the exact opposite." LeMay and his generals continued to angrily replay the lost opportunity of the Cuban Missile Crisis. "It was the moment we could have gotten the communists out of Cuba," LeMay said. "We walked Khrushchev up to the brink of nuclear war. He looked over the edge and had no stomach for it," said General David Burchinal, who served as LeMay's deputy during the crisis. "We would have written our own book at the time, but our politicians did not understand what happens when you have a degree of superiority as we had, or they simply didn't know how to use it. They were busily engaged in saving face for the Soviets and making concessions, giving up junipers deployed overseas when all we had to do was write our own ticket. In other words, kill a whole bunch of people. That's their ticket." By spring of 1963, after 2 years of turbulence, it was clear that Kennedy was searching for a way to defuse Cuba as an international flashpoint. Abiding by his missile crisis agreement with Khrushchev, the president began to crack down on the anti-Castro raids operating off the shores of Florida and to withdraw funding from the militant exile groups. In April, the leader of the Miami-based Cuban Revolutionary Council, the umbrella organization that tied them all together, announced his resignation, accusing the administration of cutting a deal with Moscow to coexist with Castro. It was now clear that despite his pronouncements of solidarity with Cuban freedom fighters, Kennedy was not serious about overthrowing the Havana regime. This marked the fateful turning point when the rabid CIA-sponsored activity that had been aimed at Castro began to focus on Kennedy. As Kennedy de-escalated the U.S. campaign against Havana, the violent anti-Castro network of spooks, political extremists, paramilitary adventurers, and assassins went underground. The scheming hotbed of exile activity, like Miami, New Orleans, and Dallas, grew more vicious in the spring and early summer of '63. Mysterious characters with blood in their eyes began to make appearances on the historic stage. One day, Dulles called his former lover, Claire Luce, to warn her about Kennedy's administration crackdown on the maritime raids that she was helping finance. He said to get out of that boat business. He was well aware of it by the way, because the Neutrality Act was now being reasserted, and it was against the law to aid and abet the Cubans in any attempt to free their country, Allen Dulles told her. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't discuss William Pawley. Dulles's old friend, William Pawley, the Miami entrepreneur / millionaire, who had long collaborated on secret CIA missions, was also warned about his involvement in the exile raids, but he remained defiant, hatching a plot so ambitious that he claimed it would bring down Kennedy himself. In April, Pawley wrote a long letter to his political comrade, Richard Nixon, declaring, quote, "All of the Cubans and most Americans in this part of the country believe that we have to remove Castro. You must first remove Kennedy to do that, and that is not going to be easy." What? William Polly wrote a letter saying in order to remove Castro, they were going to have to remove JFK. Polly's plan was to assemble a rogue crew of mafia hitman men and Cuban desperados and to set sail on his 65-foot yacht, the Flying Tiger II, because just keep in mind, this is the guy that financed the Flying Tigers that aided Chiang Kai shek in flying opium and weapons around Southeast Asia. So he wanted to use his yacht off the waters of Cuba, accompanied by a reporter and photographer from Life magazine to document their mission. Once ashore in Cuba, the raiders were to rendezvous with two supposed Soviet military officers based on the island who wanted to defect to the US, bringing them back to the US with explosive evidence that Khrushchev had double-crossed Kennedy and had never withdrawn his missiles. The mission went nowhere. There were no missiles, nor were there Soviet defectors. And the raiders themselves all disappeared into Castro's security net. Years later, two of the mercenaries who had slithered through Miami's anti-Castro underground in the early 60s claimed that Polly's raid had been a cover for yet another CIA mafia assassination attempt on Castro. The plotting against the Cuban leader continued to flourish, even after CIA assured Kennedy administration that everything had been terminated, including the working with the mafia. Again, the CIA does not work for the president. Two emissaries from the CIA informed Bobby Kennedy of the assassination plots at a meeting in his Justice Department office in May of 1962. The Attorney General, who had built his law enforcement reputation as an aggressive mob hunter, listened to the CIA men with barely concealed fury. Quote, "I trust that if you ever do business with organized crime again, with gangsters, you will let the Attorney General know," Bobby said icily. The CIA officials assured Bobby that the Eisenhower-approved plots had been shut down, but in truth, they continued without the Kennedys' knowledge throughout their entire administration and years later. The displays of disrespect for JFK's authority grew more glaring in the clubs and suites in Washington's permanent government. By the spring of 1963, JFK was painfully aware of the profound miscalculation he had made by appointing Eisenhower Dulles holdovers and designating conservatives to do liberal things, particularly in the case of John McCone. In March, the president's secret White House recording system picked up a heated conversation between the Kennedy brothers about their increasing disloyal CIA director, McCone. Bobby informed his brother he was going around Washington feeding anti-Kennedy information to the press. You know, lies to the press about the US president in America, the CIA, just like they did Trump. JFK's response? He's a real bastard, that John McCone. Well, he was useful at the time, observed Bobby. Yeah, said the president, but boy, it's really evaporated. Between Dulles, who had made a show of harmony with the White House early in his retirement, telling friends that he would continue to consult with the president, no longer felt a need to keep up the pretense. He became increasingly outspoken in his remarks about Kennedy, despite their earlier non-confrontation. He had displayed for the good of the country, according to Dulles. In June, after delivering a lecture at Cold Spring Harbor near his Long Island home, Dulles told reporters that he doubted he would ever be willing to work again for the Kennedy administration. He was never going to be allowed to work for the Kennedy administration. He also made clear that the president was not serious about ousting Castro. Quote, I don't know of anything that can be done about Cuba short of intervention. Once a communist regime gets fastened in a country and the military regime is built up, it's hard to get the regime changed. Unquote. He was building a narrative. In October 1963, Dulles went public with his most direct criticism of the JFK administration in a militant address that he titled The Art of Persuasion, America's Role in the Ideological Struggle. In it, Dulles ridiculed the administration's yearning to be loved by the rest of the world. No country that wishes to be really popular should aspire or accept the role of leadership. The U.S. was too rich and too powerful, Dulles declared, and that's the way it must remain. Quote, I should much prefer to have people respect us than try to make them love us. They should realize that we propose to remain strong economically and militarily, that we have firm principles, I don't know what the hell they are, and a steady foreign policy and will not compromise with communism or appease it, unquote. Here it was at last, Dulles's critique of the Kennedy presidency in stark relief. JFK was viewed as an appeaser, a weak leader who wanted to be loved by our friends and enemies when the man in the White House should be feared. Well, in order to be feared, you have to commit terrorist organization type activities, which they preferred. Dulles maintained a busy schedule throughout 63, speaking, traveling, and meeting with an intriguing mix of intelligence colleagues, high-powered friends, and at least on one occasion, a member of the anti-Castro tribe. The pages of Dulles's crowded 1963 calendar that were later released by the CIA contain numerous gaps and blackouts. Redacted. But even with the curious blanks, his appointment book has the look of belonging to an active spy who was still fully engaged in spy life. Dulles's calendar pages and other declassified documents give a provocative hint about the retired spy life, including the identities of some of the obscure characters with whom he was associating. Here was a man, say these pages, to whom people still looked to get things done. In the summer of 63, Peter Dell Scott, a young English literature professor at the University of California, Berkeley campus, found himself in the thick of anti-Kennedy ferment. Scott, the son of a distinguished Canadian poet, had served as a Canadian diplomat to Poland, and much of his social life when he arrived in Berkeley revolved around passionately anti-Soviet Polish immigrants. One day, a former Polish army colonel who had befriended Scott invited him to a dinner party at the home of W. Glenn Campbell, the intellectual entrepreneur who built Stanford's Hoover Institute into a leading center of conservative resurgence in America. At Campbell's home that evening, the conversation among the 16 or so guests grew heated as it turned to JFK. In those days, I was not very politically active, but I was amazed, even shocked, at how reactionary the conversation became around the dinner table, Scott later recalled. Most of the talk focused on the danger presented to the nation by the president, JFK. His failure to depose Castro, especially during the missile crisis, may have been one of the chief complaints, but it was by no means the only one. The complaints threatened to drag on forever until one man spoke up with authority. I'm not sure, but he may have even stood up to do so. The striking figure who commanded the group's attention was a Russian Orthodox priest with a crucifix hanging around his neck. He spoke quietly but with confidence, assuring the group that they had no need to worry. His exact quote was, "The old man," which is in reference to Dulles, "will take care of it." At the time, Scott assumed the priest was referring to Joe Kennedy, who presumably could be counted on to set his son straight. But by 1963, the Kennedy patriarch was confined to a wheelchair after suffering a massive stroke in December of 1961. That left him severely disabled. It was not until years later that Scott realized the Russian priest was not likely referring to someone else. By then, the Berkeley professor was a respected dean of the JFK assassination research community and had devoted years to studying the political forces surrounding JFK's murder. In conversation with a fellow Kennedy researcher one day, Scott was reminded of the nickname by which Allen Dulles was affectionately known inside of the intelligence circles, the Old Man. On that summer evening in 1963, the Russian immigrant priest spoke with calm assurance of a man who knew something the others did not. "The old man will take care of it." That was enough to calm the heated conversation around the table. The old man will take care of the Kennedy problem. Among the particular figures with whom Dulles met in the spring and summer of 1963 was a militant anti-Castro exile by the name of Paulino Sierra Martinez, whose background and affiliations were so murky that even the CIA labeled him a mystery man in a memo dated November 20th. According to an internal CIA document, Sierra arranged to meet with Dulles and retired General Lucius Clay in Washington on April 15th, 1963. Dulles and Clay were unusual company for a man not long before had been working as a judo instructor in Miami while studying to take his law exams. Like Dulles, General Clay occupied positions on top ranks of American establishment. After serving in the U.S. military governorship in post-war Germany, Clay had worked with Dulles in Cold War propaganda projects under the guise of Crusade for Freedom, which was a CIA front. Returning to Germany in 1961 as an advisor to JFK during the Berlin Wall crisis, Clay dangerously escalated the crisis without the president's authorization by threatening to knock down the recently erected wall with U.S. Army tanks. It took all of Kennedy's brother's back-channel diplomatic skills to defuse the confrontation at Checkpoint Charlie. A disgusted Clay later accused Kennedy of losing his nerve. He had never authorized it. By 1963, Clay had given up military service for a corporate career. Where did he go? Lehman Brothers, a Wall Street investment firm, and he got a seat on the General Motors board, among other companies. What I find interesting about this is if you guys, I don't know if I even mentioned it, but those stay-behind units of U.S. military in Germany talk about Checkpoint Charlie all the time. Paulino Sierra Martinez was not the type of man with whom Dulles or Clay normally dined at the Army-Navy Club or the Metropolitan Club. He was the son of a Cuban police sergeant. Sierra had worked his way up in the Havana society, landing a job for the dictator Batista in his foreign ministry. Some of his intimates suggested that Sierra's government post was a cover for his real profession. He was an assassin. Fleeing Castro's Cuban, Sierra settled first in Miami, but after passing his U.S. bar exams, he went to work in the legal department at the Union Tank Car Company in Chicago. It was a railroad freight company that had been built by the Rockefeller family. It was in Chicago that Sierra suddenly emerged as a mysterious player in the confusing and conflict ridden Cuban exile movement. In May of 63, following his Washington meeting with Dulles and Clay, Sierra, who was virtually unknown in anti Castro circles, convened a meeting of Cuban exile leaders at the Royalton Hotel in Miami. The leaders were skeptical about the well dressed man from Chicago with a homely face that put some people in the mind of Lincoln. But the anti Castro movement was in disarray following Kennedy's withdrawal of support, and Sierra arrived in Miami with a proposal and the promise of big money. Sierra told the group that he represented an alliance of major U.S. corporations that wanted to regain their lost investments in Cuba. International Syndicate, anybody? He did not name the companies, but on other occasions, he did drop names. Interestingly enough, they were names like United Fruit, again, U.S. Steel, DuPont. U.S. Steel is very interesting given what we covered yesterday about U.S. Steel stabbing Kennedy in the back and then Kennedy calling their bluff. And last but not least, Standard Oil. Sierra claimed that these corporations was willing to put up as much as $30 million in 1960s. If they could fracture the anti-Castro movement, if the fractured anti-Castro movement could reassemble itself and mount an invasion of the island. He explained that such an operation would not have Washington's official approval, but would be supported by officers within the U.S. military who would provide weapons and training bases. Freely spending money around, Sierra attracted enough support from within the anti-Castro network to form a coalition he ambitiously titled the Junta of Government of Cuba in Exile. He crisscrossed the country drumming up support for this new organization and went on a weapons buying spree. The sources of his funds, which were passed to him through Union tank car, remained something of a mystery, although in an article in the Miami News indicated that at least some of his money was coming from organized crime lords who were intent on winning back their Havana gambling casinos and prostitution networks, which before Cuba had been a huge source of money for them. Law enforcement agencies began tracking Sierra as he pursued his shady agenda. But in June, the FBI mysteriously terminated his investigation after concluding there was nothing to see there. The Chicago office of the Secret Service, however, suspected that Sierra was a sinister figure. By November of 1963, Chicago, like Miami, New Orleans, and Dallas, had become a nest of anti-Kennedy intrigue. And where did Jack Ruby come from? Chicago. On November 2nd, local Secret Service officials foiled a well-organized assassination plot against Kennedy. After landing at Chicago's O'Hare Airport that day, Kennedy was scheduled to ride in a motorcade to Soldier Field for the annual Army-Navy football game. But the motorcade was canceled after Secret Service exposed a plot to ambush the president from a tall warehouse building as his limousine slowed for a hairpin turn. You know, kind of like Dallas. The plot, which involved a sniper team composed of a disgruntled ex-Marine who, oh, that's weird, who worked in the building. What? And at least two Cuban marksmen bore a disturbing resemblance to the Dallas plot. The Secret Service could not connect Sierra to the Chicago assassination plot, but his name did come up in relation to another troubling report. On November 21st, the day before JFK's assassination, a serious threat against the president was made by an outspoken anti Kennedy Cuban exile leader Homer Escavera while negotiating an illegal arms purchase. Escavera reportedly said that he had plenty of money and would conclude the deal as soon as we take care of Kennedy. Sources told the Secret Service that Escavera weapons purchase was being financed by Sierra with mob money. After the president's assassination, the Secret Service planned to pursue an investigation into Escavera's threat and the Sierra arms deal. But the agency's probe was shut down again by the FBI after JFK was in office. Following Kennedy's death, Paulino Sierra Martinez faded from the front lines of the anti-Castro campaign. Accused by Union tank cars' legal counsel of wasting the junta's funds, he was eventually replaced as head of the organization. But according to relatives of Sierra, he continued to pursue his underground war against Castro and other left-wing leaders in Latin America. Tough-looking men carrying concealed rifles showed up from time to time at Sierra's Chicago apartment, men whom one of his children described as a bandito. Sierra, who frequently packed his own gun, even when taking his young granddaughter to the zoo, continued to travel widely well into the 1970s, including to Chile, where he briefly relocated during the CIA-orchestrated coup of Salvador Allende in 1973. Although Sierra never discussed his hidden life with his son, Paul Sierra became convinced that his father was involved in U.S. intelligence. Quote, "I think that personally, father's patriotism and hatred for communism made him go a little overboard," unquote, the son said. More than a dozen years after the Secret Service's abortive efforts to find out more about Paulino Sierra Martinez, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which reopened the JFK case in 1970s, again raised the questions, who was he? The sprawling congressional investigation ultimately concluded that Kennedy was the victim of a conspiracy, but it was unable to pin down the identities of who were involved or where they got their money, because they didn't want to. Committee investigators were intrigued by Sierra's unsavory connections, including to three sketchy characters that show up with Lee Harvey Oswald at the Dallas home of Sylvia Odio, O-D-I-O, the daughter of a prominent anti-Castro activist in September of 1963. But in the end, lacking the time and resources to fully pursue its leads, the congressional panel was forced to acknowledge that the relevance to the assassination of Sierra's activities remain undetermined on purpose. At least the House Select Committee on Assassinations tried to shed light on Sierra, in another kabuki dance. The first official inquest into President Kennedy's assassination conducted by the Warren Commission of 1964, but they made no serious effort to examine anti-Castro militants like Sierra and their connections to the CIA or organized crime. No kidding. Because no one wants to investigate the CIA for real. Despite the Secret Service's suspicion about Sierra, his name appears nowhere in the Warren Report's 26 volumes. Allen Dulles, a prominent member of the Warren Commission, could have revealed what he knew about Sierra, because he certainly knew about him. But Dulles never brought it up, nor did he ever inform fellow commissioners that he had met with someone whom the Secret Service regarded as a person of interest in the JFK assassination. He was there for one reason only, and that was to cover up the assassination of JFK. It remains one of those enduring mysteries of the JFK case. Why did Dulles meet with Paulino Sierra Martinez in April of 1963? What brought together the former CIA director and an obscure mafia-connected anti-Castro conspirator with a penchant for violent action. He was an assassin. As Dulles was keenly aware, organizing a paramilitary operation against Cuban government was, by the spring of 1963, a violation of law, a violation of JFK's policy. By meeting with a character like Sierra, Dulles made it abundantly clear he didn't give a shit. So that's the end of the chapter, and I'm not going to start the new chapter today. We'll hold off on that until Monday. So, comments?
Serious string pullers, right? Reminds me of, well, Marionette, or even the Punch and Judy sock puppet deal, where nothing is as it seems. Somebody else is manipulating everything down to the plot, the theme, what words are spoken. And that Dulles needs to be buried underneath that big pile that we were talking about, underneath all the nuclear waste.
I agree completely. He should be exhumed and reburied in the pile of rubble around the CIA.
Amen.
SR, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel, and thank everyone for being here on Spaces and on Rumble. We appreciate your support, as always. It's very different to look back at history and see exactly what transpired and get the picture of what's happening today. I can see it. There's no doubt about that. But during that period of time, I don't think people really understood what was going on. Because, I mean, even after Kennedy had been assassinated, the whole nation was in mourning. I don't think the nation knew anything about what was really happening. It just, oh man, like I said, my mind is blown.
Yep, I agree. And people don't want to believe the worst. I mean, you still have people that, we survived COVID and still have no clue what's going on. And that to me is just mind numbing. But there's some people that just don't want to know. Warhamster, did you have anything you wanted to say?
I did. Howdy.
Hi.
Sorry I missed the show earlier today. I'm still recovering, but we're getting there. So right off the bat, you're talking about the dinner with Alan Dulles and Henry Luce. And it just cracked me up because everybody's been talking an awful lot about the Smith-Mundt Act and repealing it's been making a lot of noise. And just a quick refresher, Smith-Mundt Act said, CIA, you can go anywhere in the world and use the media and the radio and propaganda to achieve our, shall we say, international goals of resource extraction, etc. But you can't use those tools here in America. And yet here we have the guy who founded the biggest media outlet in the country, Henry Luce, Skull and Bones, owner of Time Life and Sports Illustrated, among a few others, having dinner with a head of the CIA who implements those exact same propaganda tactics. And they're not just having dinner, they were very, very close. And so you got to wonder, did the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act that Obama put in 2011, is it just formalizing something that's been going on for more than 50 years? Because you sure as hell know the CIA was operating here already.
Right.
To do it so blatantly and in the open. And, it's, people should have been asking a lot more questions back then about that relationship.
Well, according to this book, Alan Dulles slept with Claire Luce. So,
yeah, like I said, very close relationship.
Yeah, very, very close relationship. And that's why I laugh every time somebody brings that up. Oh, we've got to bring that back and all of this. I'm like, why? The people that do this don't give a crap about what the law is. they've been doing, I mean, it was all exposed in 1970. That's where the term mockingbird media came from. The CIA's been doing this shit for the entire time that it's existed. And
yeah, I think that's almost the entire point of Obama. Is we know the CIA's doing it. Maybe we're going to give permission to all of its outlets in the mainstream media so they can, do it more openly. But that's about it.
Right, and that's kind of that's what they do. That's like the USAID first person coming out and saying, "Yeah, we just do overtly what the CIA used to do covertly." I mean, he said that out loud.
The whole purpose of a non-government organization is to do things the government can't admit that it's doing. But it's still funded from the same source and gets orders from the same people. It's the exact same story over and over again.
Yes.
The other comment I had was, once again, Lehman Brothers pops up, and I just went back and reviewed all my notes while we were talking. Lehman Brothers is mentioned now 17 different times in our Skull and Bones and Scroll and Key series. So,
da-da!
Rest in peace, Lehman Brothers.
Yep. All along, go ahead.
Yeah, Colonel, I think your SR 71's comment about, what people knew at that time regarding the CIA is very important to bear in mind, because we are, looking backwards, are kind of like seeing through the prism of what became available in the classic 1974, 78 years when there was some oversight, and we know it was qualified oversight, but I still think it's very important to look at how it got qualified, because that's the giveaway right there that the CIA is running everything, and we need to emphasize that. But I mean, it's a very relevant point, because if the public does not have, at the time of the assassination, the kind of vocabulary of, what we would call the deep state, or even vague remnants of it. I mean, I guess they had something, the 64 book by The Secret Government came out in 1964, right? So it's like a year later. But that's extremely important to bear in mind, that there's a lag time in public awareness about how to analyze what today we call the deep state. We know it was there. We know it was doing incredible amounts of things, including running, directly contravening presidential policy and then shooting JFK, little stuff like that. But it's so important to realize that there was a lag time in awareness of the public having the, analytical tools to talk about the CIA. And then again, after that, it was deliberately obfuscated by changing the name from National Security State to Deep State, and just doing everything possible to prevent mediation. The real job of media is to prevent mediated public discussion, so everybody can think whatever they want, and it's never going to matter because no one can form any public agreement. And I think your point also about Warhamster's point about Obama and the repeal of the first saw that, I'm like, what the fuck is going on here? Because we all know that this has been nonstop, but you could see the propaganda advantage. It's almost like, oh, so they hadn't been doing that before,
Right.
And they don't care if some people know that it's bullshit, but they all they care is you have a whole new generation of high school graduates and college graduates coming out, and they don't know this history.
Right.
And that's for them. And they work this trick in other areas too, like among the some so-called, controlled left. You'll get these people saying, oh, if only it wasn't for the Citizens United Act. And it's like, meanwhile, the Citizens United Act is way after the horse, is way long, 20, 30 years after them. And it's not causing anything But by saying, oh, the Smith Month, the Citizens United decision in the Supreme Court, it gets people thinking, oh, the courts really decide stuff. They're really, which in turn, it's the most conservative or let's say elitist wing of government of the three branches. And, it's not it's the least susceptible to popular pressure. So they want to legitimate that idea that Supreme Courts are really, really important. Meanwhile, we have a friggin' dead legislative branch, an absolutely dead branch, and no one says a word about it,
Right.
And again, we say the same thing is that you point to something more recent as seemingly causal when it's just really not even a symptom, and it can make the length of the corruption kind of disappear for like 60% of the population or more.
Right. That's a great observation. Renee, go ahead. Or I'm sorry, Travis, and then Renee. I'm sorry, I saw Travis's hand first. Hold on just a second, Renee. Go ahead, Travis.
I just wanted to say the thing that we all need to realize and face is that unless we're older than 77, we are all victims of Mockingbird and MK Ultra all of our lives. The fact that we are here now and aware is an amazing accomplishment for each and every one in this space. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. I agree. Go ahead, Renee. Renee, go ahead.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a request, please, for you and Warhamster, or maybe I missed it. I don't know. Did you all ever do a series on Princeton University and like the cap and gown and the Hun School and all that stuff? Because wasn't Dulles, that's where he and his brother went, didn't they, to Princeton University?
They went to Princeton, that's true. Yeah, and no, we have not.
Well, it's the whole stinking Ivy League, even going back to the foundation. It's been used to, create these backdoor clubs and everything like that. And there's a few in particular that are a little bit more. I mean, like, look at Harvard Law School may as well have their own unspoken secret society, but look at how many of these people are involved in the same darn treaties and stuff like that. And we're going to do a series, because so much of the initial OSS and CIA came out of Columbia. And of course, we've done Yale, but you can pretty much just pin that on the entire Ivy League. And, of course, almost all of their people come from the Ivy League prepping grooming schools.
Yep.
So it goes back even further than that. So.
Yeah, we have to be, obviously, it could take 20 years to go through all of them. We picked the ones that are the most notorious to highlight them. They are not exclusive. Every one of them, as Warhamster said, have their own avenues into this power structure. And they're basically just grooming people for it. The college experience in the Ivy League for as far back as we've looked, which is, the 1800s, were used to basically psychoanalyze young people that they could groom into playing roles in this international syndicate, because these guys all end up being in the Praetorian Guard. And that was a recruitment field based on who was the president, who were the deans, and who were in charge of these different schools. There's no other conclusion once you look into it that you can come to, that they were using them both as Warhamster articulates, those prep schools and into the Ivy League colleges. And there's select other ones around the country. But again, it's all indicative of a pool of young talent that they can groom and make into people that they can control.
Yeah. I'm reminded of Catherine Austin Fitz, a video I watched of her about a year ago, and I'm pretty sure Colonel, you and I talked about it. And she's about, if you don't know who she is, she's worked in Washington D.C. at a pretty high level, I think, with Treasury or one of the Federal Reserve banks, and she's also been pretty successful in the Wall Street world. She knows how this stuff works. She's been looking into it for decades, and her conclusion in that video was, I'm trying to find who the real puppet masters are, who are the ones that call the shots. Because if I had to place a bet, it would be the people behind the foundations of the Ivy League schools.
Yeah.
And I don't think she's far off from the truth. Although, you know me, all roads lead to the Rockefellers. But
yeah. SR, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel. I just want to say, out of all of this, if everyone's really paying attention at this point, we really should demolish the CIA. Not rebuild it, not any of that. It needs to be gotten rid of, period. I see the parallelism that's going on with Trump now and what Kennedy put up with that we didn't even know. You got people behind his back doing stuff, knowing full well that that was not his orders. We had the same with Trump. You got people in Afghanistan that Trump says, nope, we're pulling it out, reassign them, bring them home, and they just get reassigned in Afghanistan. How can you miss all of that?
Right.
Thank you, Colonel.
Sure.
Colonel, can I respond to that?
Sure.
It's a really good point. I don't think we've gone deeply enough into it. And if you've done this in some of your books, correct me if I'm wrong, but at the outset of the CIA, once the OSS had to be terminated after the end of the war, they had to pass the National Security Act of 1947. It was crystal clear that we needed intelligence gathering during peacetime for the first time ever. And the debate was whether that would just be intelligence gathering or there would be covert operations. And obviously, initially, it was just intelligence gathering, and very shortly thereafter, the covert operations guys took over. I replied to one of the colonel's tweets this week, saying, it's kind of my observation has been that once you get covert operations in place, it starts to distort the raw intelligence, because it becomes, you need to have intelligence that backs the reason for the covert operation. You end up putting it's the tail wagging the dog instead of the other way around. So if you're going to, I don't think in this world you can get rid of the need to gather intelligence, but can you stop the covert operations that go with it and muddies all the water so the intelligence is now completely warped? And that's really the challenge. And I guess the question I would ask the colonel is, when I've had this conversation with other people, is, wouldn't military intelligence or the NSA be enough to get the intelligence that we need? Do we have to have another intelligence arm? Because right now we have 17 intelligence agencies, including the Coast Guard.
So to answer that question, my non-intelligence answer has been, within 6 months of this project, that the CIA, if it went away today, would not be missed at all. The DIA and the NSA provide the foreign raw intelligence data, and they always have. The DIA and the NSA has entities all over the world. The NSA has spy ships. The USS Liberty was one of them. Now we have satellite capability. There is enough intelligence gathering to the point of raw intelligence overload. And the sifting through of that intelligence within the services of the military, because obviously the air component has needs for different types of intelligence than the ground components, than the sea components. So you can justify having specialized intelligence within the respective services. But you also have within the combatant commanders another array, and they're not considered separate intelligence agencies, but They travel every day on the ground in their respective areas of operation and gather intelligence that is fed back into this system. So we have way more intelligence than we would ever need to have as a country. The only purpose, regardless of what Truman said, because Truman is the one that gave him the covert capability, the only purpose of the CIA from the get-go was a way that the oligarchs could generate their own intelligence to say what they wanted it to say. They were never, ever designed to just gather. I don't care what anybody says. That's a lie. The CIA was designed, even on the intelligence side, to provide intelligence to get a particular outcome. And then they had already set up the Office of Policy Coordination in the State Department long before it ever was moved to the CIA. They were going to use the intelligence gathered, and you can't even call it intelligence. It's garbage. The shit that they generate that they call intelligence was fed to Frank Wisner's Office of Policy Coordination. That was kind of a hybrid between the DOD and the State Department, before it was then finally moved inside of the CIA. But that was what they were going to do. They had already, in the middle, towards the end of World War II, set up the stay-behind units. This was all a plan. Everything else is noise. So it's not weird that you have all of these intelligence reports that claim there's communists around every corner around the world, while at the same time you have a national security action memorandum that says you can kill anybody that's deemed a communist. So when you have a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And that's the whole story of the CIA. Even as just an intelligence gathering organization, it was never designed to gather actual intelligence. It was designed to manipulate the intelligence to warrant the action that was already being planned.
That is exactly the point I was making.
Yeah.
About once the covert action becomes part of it, it's the tail wagging the dog.
The best example that I found is reading State Department cables from actual analysts in Guatemala in the lead up to the 1954 coup that were saying there's no Soviet involvement in Guatemala at all. There's none. And yet there's CIA declassified memorandums where the CIA higher ups, like the station chief and the ambassador in Guatemala, is cabling Washington, D.C. and telling them that there's a communist around every corner.
Well, let me give you a more recent example than that, because we're about to see this come out with Russiagate, because the intelligence community assessment said that there was no Russian involvement. Obama didn't like that report.
Correct.
Orders Brennan to go back there and create a new report. That stuff is what is being investigated in the Florida grand juries right this second.
Yep.
We've got the smoking guns on that.
Yep.
That is public information at this point in time.
Yes.
So it goes. What was Guatemala? 1953.
54.
So here we are, 60 years later. They're doing the exact same. And that's the other thing about the damn CIA. They don't get that creative. They run the same playbook.
Correct.
Over and over again.
Correct.
Student body left, student body right. That's all they did. That's why it's so easy to spot the patterns at this point.
Yes. And that's kind of, again, going back to my military days, when you go into a plan shop in the military, there's lots of plans on the shelf. There's very few plans on the CIA shelf. They run the same plan over and over again, and very rarely do they deviate from that plan. All along, go ahead.
Yeah, Colonel, I just wanted to add on regarding this sort of critical 1947 to 1952 period. I mentioned this book by Stewart, last name Stewart, Princeton University Press, called The Creation of the National Security State. And one of the points that kind of stands out is in that book is that at the time, most of the discussion and public awareness was concerning the new Secretary of Defense and the getting, given the history of the rivalry between the different services, with the critical creation of this new branch of Air Force, because as you said many times, it wasn't, there was no Air Force or it was called the Army Air Corps, and we know how critically important the Air Force intelligence ties are to CIA. And I mean, I would think that probably they're the closest to the CIA of the, if you could break it down that way, that might be wrong. I don't know. It's just a vibe I've kind of gotten. But because, it involves so tremendous amount of the new advanced technology, and the MICC factor can come into play there, where you have industry spread out across the country that can pressure Congress in ways that most of the country can never see, because it's all coming from different places, and it's kind of decentralized, MICC in that sense that the Air Force is so good at, because of its incredibly, emphasis on new technologies. And but anyway, yeah, it's worth pointing out, I think, that at the time, more of the attention was on the centralization of the services, and could this new Secretary of State thingy, deal with that? Apparently not, if we look at some accounts of the first one's unfortunate end. But and that Stewart's other point is, I mean, it's kind of general, but there's a considerable amount of ambiguity about the CIA and their control over the other intelligence services, and they were able to use that ambiguity to just, within the NSC, to just expand their power tremendously.
So to your point about the Air Force, I think the observation was true in 1947 up until probably 19 maybe in the 70s, because of nuclear weapons. And not that the Navy didn't have nuclear weapons, but, and we see by Burke that they were as warmongering as the Air Force, but the command over the Air Force of the SAC leadership, the Strategic Air Command, which are the bombers that deliver the nuclear weapons, as well as being in command of all of the missile bases in the United States, they were tied to the hip in many ways. They were courted by the CIA because collectively they very much were interested in using nuclear weapons. And when it comes to tactical nuclear weapons, you're really talking about the Navy and the Air Force. And I think that they were pretty joined at the hip as far as the CIA grooming the military leadership. Not that they don't do that now, but especially back then, because of their wanting to use broad brush tactical nuclear weapons in order to achieve their end state. And so I agree with that. I think that changed when we went to a more satellite-based capability, because it kind of equaled all of the playing field, because they all have access to that same, and it got more diffused, if you will. among the services. But it's a point well taken. Okay. Lively discussion. I love it. I think that's it. I have another Tommy podcast tomorrow. And I don't know if you guys stayed for the whole conversation last night on the show that I did. It was a very interesting show. I loved it on Justice Cometh podcast. And there was a gentleman that joined us towards the end of the podcast that is a computer guru. And I don't, too bad Illini didn't join us, because I definitely talked about him. And he does the whole brain mapping thing and is very, very good at it. So I'm going to try to have a conversation with him on Sunday and see what capabilities he has already. But I will tell you something, Warhamster. He has mapped a lot of the Pilgrim Society. So we're definitely doing the Pilgrim Society. And he has some crazy maps done of the Pilgrim Society. And he got so excited when I mentioned the Pilgrim Society, because he was talking about the link between London and New York City. And I never met him. He had not, looked at my work or anything else, or our work, I should say. And it was funny when I said, "Oh, you're talking about the Pilgrim Society." And he goes, "Oh my gosh." Because so few people talk about the Pilgrim Society, and it is like one of the key things to this entire puzzle. It drives home the point that Anthony Sutton made in his books. It is literally the overarching link pin between the oligarchs in Europe and the oligarchs in America. And he just took me through a few minutes of the links that he had already set up in there about the Pilgrim Society, and it was hilarious. But anyway, what I want to do, and what he has been doing, is he is working on a tool that will allow AI to take a book and draw the brain map of the book. And when he gets that done, he's not there yet, but when he gets that done, it will be amazing for our work. And I wish him Godspeed for doing it. He's down in Australia. So I'm going to try to talk to him on Sunday, which should be a very interesting conversation. Renee, go ahead.
Yes, looking forward to the deep dive on the Pilgrim Society, and just wanted to give a little reminder that part of Queen Elizabeth I's council was Francis Bacon and John Dee, and John Dee was her intelligence in the original 007 back in the 1500s. So I think that was just a little, I've been kind of digging into that myself lately, of the origins of intelligence, and it goes that far back. But just wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Warhamster, did you want to say something?
No, feel free to tag me on that call on Sunday.
Okay.
I'll pick up if I can. It'll be an interesting conversation.
Okay. All right, guys. Take care. Have a nice weekend. We'll be back here on Monday at 4:00. Take care. All right, guys. Take care.